She'd been counting the same car for 19 days. A charcoal sedan, cracked windshield, no front plates, always 3 car lengths behind the bus, always gone by the time she reached the school steps. Nobody believed a 10-year-old girl, not her teacher, not the vice principal, not even her own mother, who was working double shifts and running on 4 hours of sleep and didn't have room in her chest for one more thing to be afraid of. But the car was real. And somewhere in the hills above the highway, 4 men with scarred hands and quiet engines were about to find out just how real it was, and how far they were willing to go to stand between a child and the darkness already closing in around her. If you've ever been told your fear wasn't real, stay with me. This one's for you. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. And don't go anywhere, because this story is only just beginning. The sketchbook had 43 pages. Avery Cross knew this because she'd counted them twice on the morning her teacher, Mrs. Delgado, slid it back across the reading group table without looking at it, without opening it, without so much as glancing at the columns of handwritten times and license plate fragments and the careful little drawings of a cracked windshield that Avery had pressed into the paper so hard she'd nearly torn through. "Honey," Mrs. Delgado said, and already Avery could hear the shape of the sentence before it arrived, already feel the specific weight of that particular kind of kindness that wasn't kind at all. "You have a very big imagination." Avery didn't answer. She picked up the sketchbook and tucked it into her backpack between her math folder and her lunch bag, the one with the broken zipper that her mom kept meaning to replace. She didn't say anything for the rest of reading group. She traced a scratch on the tabletop with one fingernail and stared at a poster on the far wall that said, "Believe in yourself," in bright yellow letters, and thought about the crack in the sedan's windshield, how it started just above the passenger mirror and ran diagonally toward the driver's side, how it split near the top into 2 thinner lines like a river dividing, how she had drawn it 17 times and it always looked the same because it was always the same car. She was not imagining it. The morning had started the way every morning started. Her mother, Jess Cross, was already gone before 6. Double shifts at the care home on Miramar Road meant she left a granola bar and a handwritten sticky note on the kitchen counter every morning that said things like, "Don't forget your jacket," or "Home by 7, call if you need me." And once, memorably, just a drawing of a small heart, because she hadn't had time to write anything else. Avery had kept that one. She kept it folded in the front pocket of the sketchbook, behind the cover page. She walked the 4 blocks to the bus stop alone, the way she always did. The neighborhood was the quiet kind of quiet that happened when too many people had left, and the ones who stayed didn't come out early. Brown grass between sidewalk cracks. A palm tree at the end of Cortez Street that leaned hard to the east like it was always trying to leave. The bus stop had a bench with one end broken off, and a trash can that smelled like something had died in it sometime in the summer and been forgotten there. She sat on the good end of the bench and unzipped her backpack and took out the sketchbook. Day 19. She wrote the date in the top corner of a new page, the way she always did. She wrote the time, 7:04 a.m., and then she looked up at the end of the street the way she always did, and she waited. It was 4 minutes before the charcoal sedan appeared. It came around the corner off Delgado Street, which was 2 blocks east, and it moved the way it always moved, not fast, not slow, just steady and deliberate, the way something moved when it was trying not to be noticed, but wasn't actually worried about being noticed. The front plates were missing. The windshield crack was there. She wrote, 7:08 a.m., Cortez Plus bus stop, charcoal. No front plate. Crack same, parked 40 feet east. She looked up twice more while writing. The car didn't move. The bus arrived at 7:22. The car stayed with them for 11 blocks. She wrote all of it down. She always wrote all of it down. Vice Principal Torres had a large desk and a smaller soul. That was how Avery had come to think of him after the second time she'd sat across from him in the plastic chair that faced his window. A window that looked out onto the parking lot and the flat brown hills beyond the school fence. He was not a cruel man. He was something more difficult than that. He was a man who had decided somewhere along the way that children were unreliable narrators of their own lives, and that the kindest thing you could do for one was smile and reduce their fear to something manageable. Avery. He leaned forward, He put his hands flat on the desk the way adults did when they wanted you to understand they were being serious. Has anyone ever talked to you about anxiety? She looked at him. Because sometimes when we're under a lot of stress at home, he let that pause do the work she knew he intended it to do. The absent father, the overworked mother, the free lunch program, the twice-repaired backpack. Our minds can start to see patterns that aren't really there. The crack in the windshield is shaped like a river, Avery said. It splits near the top. I can describe it exactly the same way every day because it's the same car every day. I've spoken to Officer Reyes. Officer Reyes said he hadn't seen it. Because he drove that route 3 separate mornings, and he drove it in a marked car, Avery said. The sedan doesn't come when there's a marked car nearby. There was a silence. Torres's expression didn't change. She'd noticed that adults' expressions rarely changed when you said something that complicated the story they'd already decided to tell themselves. He picked up a pen and set it down again. I'm going to call your mom, he said. We'll set up a meeting. Avery picked up her backpack. You won't, though, she said, not meanly, just factually, because you already decided I'm imagining it, and calling my mom would make more work. She was right. He didn't call. The garage sat at the end of a dead-end industrial street called Tanner Spur, where 3 other businesses had given up and shuttered their roll-down doors, and one, a carpet warehouse, had burned halfway down in 2019 and never been finished burning or finished being repaired. So it just sat there with one half of its roof intact and the other half open to the sky, full of pigeons. The garage that remained was called, plainly, Rourke's, in faded red letters that had once been bright enough to see from the end of the street, but were now the color of old brick, of old blood, of old things that had decided to stop announcing themselves to the world. Dane Rourke had bought it for almost nothing from a man named Cal Petty, who was dying of a liver complaint and wanted to go home to Nevada before the end. That had been 7 years ago. 7 years of rebuilt engines and brake jobs, and the particular smell of the place, grease and coolant and the ghost of cigarette smoke trapped permanently in the concrete floor, rising faintly on warm days no matter how many times he'd cleaned it. He was 41 years old. He had 19 tattoos, and 2 that were just scars from tattoos he'd had removed. 1 from each forearm, both of them from a chapter of his life he referred to, when he referred to it at all, only as before. He was not a large man, or rather he was not obviously large the way some men were. He didn't carry it in his chest or his shoulders, but in the stillness of him, in the way he occupied space, as if he'd already measured the room and found no part of it threatening. Brown hair going gray at the temples. Gray eyes that had a trick of seeming darker in low light, nearly black, which had unsettled people he'd interviewed with and people who'd tried to intimidate him. And once, a child psychologist who'd been brought in for court-ordered evaluation and had written in her report that his affects suggested a history of sustained environmental hypervigilance, which was a clinical way of saying he'd spent enough of his early life waiting for something bad to happen that his nervous system had simply never learned to stop waiting. He was good with engines. He was good with kids, though this was not something he would have said about himself. He had a way of listening that was very different from the way most adults listened. He didn't prepare his response while you were still talking, didn't look past you at something more important, didn't visibly sort what you were saying into relevant and not relevant before you'd finished saying it. He just listened. It was something he'd learned during a winter in Gallup, New Mexico, from an old Navajo mechanic named Hector Runningwater, who told him that the problem with most people wasn't that they talked too much, but that they listened like they were already somewhere else. He was under the hood of a 2004 Silverado when Avery Cross first appeared at his garage. He heard the footsteps before he saw her. Small boots on the concrete apron outside, a specific hesitation in the step that told him, before he looked up, that whoever was approaching had decided to leave at least once and then come back. He straightened and turned, wiping his hands on the rag tucked into his waistband, and found a small girl with dark circles under her eyes and a backpack that was slightly too big for her frame and an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the garage for a moment. She said, "Are you the one who helped Marcus Yee's family with the thing at the school?" Marcus Yee was a kid he barely knew. The family situation had been complicated and quiet, and he had done very little, made a call, stood in a parking lot, said nothing that mattered. It had been nothing. "Who told you that?" he asked. "His sister. We're in the same reading group." She paused. "She said you were the kind of person who actually listens." Dane looked at her, at the too-old expression, at the way she was holding the strap of her backpack like it was something to hold on to. "You want to come inside, but?" he said. "I don't know you." "Fair?" "My mom doesn't know I'm here." "Also fair." Another pause. The pigeons were audible from the dead warehouse. A truck went by on the main street 2 blocks away, and the sound of it came and faded. "The door stays open," Dane said. "I'll stand over here. You stand wherever you want." She came to the garage entrance, but not inside. She unzipped her backpack and took out the sketchbook and held it in both hands, and looked at him with the expression of someone who had been dismissed enough times to have developed a protocol for it, presenting the evidence first, before the words, because the words alone had stopped being sufficient. "There's a car," she said. He listened. He listened for 45 minutes. She showed him every page. He didn't interrupt. He didn't pick up his phone. He crouched down at one point to look more closely at one of the windshield drawings. She'd done it 6 times in a row on one page, each from slightly different angles, the crack always identical. And he stayed crouched for a moment after looking at it, not speaking, not dismissing, not immediately explaining why she didn't need to worry. When she finished, he looked at the sketchbook for a moment more and then looked at her. 19 days, he said. 19 days. How many times have you told somebody? She counted on her fingers. Mrs. Delgado, Torres, Officer Reyes. Her mother, twice. Once at the kitchen table and once on the phone when her mother was between shifts and sounded like she was running. The bus driver, Mr. Okonkwo, who had looked in his mirror and said he'd keep an eye out, but in the way that meant he thought she was scared of regular traffic. 6 times, she said. He nodded slowly. There was a coffee maker on the shelf above his tool bench, found a battered drip machine, the kind that needed cleaning but worked fine. He poured a mug for himself and then looked at her. You want water? I've got water and I've got terrible coffee. Water's fine. He got her a water bottle from the small refrigerator near the door. Unopened, he handed it to her with the cap still sealed so she could open it herself. She noticed that. She didn't say anything about it. The storage unit, he said. You got the address from following the route? I didn't follow. I wrote down the direction he turned after the bus stop on Garrison Avenue. Then I looked it up. There are 4 storage facilities within 6 blocks of where he turned. She pulled out the second-to-last page of the sketchbook. I circled them. He looked at the page. He set the mug down. The girl standing in the doorway of his garage, water bottle in both hands, circles on a hand-drawn map, 43 pages of consistent and detailed and completely unacknowledged documentation. Something moved in his chest that he recognized as a very old and specific kind of anger. Not hot, cold. The kind that didn't raise your voice. The kind that got things done. What's your name? Avery Cross. Avery. He folded his hands. I'm going to need to make some phone calls. Can you come back tomorrow? Same time? And this time maybe let your mom know where you are. She looked at him. You believe me, she said. Not a question, a test. I believe your sketchbook, he said. And I believe you've been telling the truth for 19 days. Yeah. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer. The afternoon light came in low behind her and caught the dust from the garage floor, and the pigeons were doing something complicated and loud in the ruined warehouse roof, and none of it mattered because for the first time in 19 days, someone had looked at her drawings and not immediately looked away. She left without saying goodbye, but she came back. Hawk Navarro came the way he always came, unannounced, at night, parking his Road King on the concrete apron without cutting the engine first, so you heard him arrive exactly as dramatically as he intended. He was 53 years old and built like a retired heavyweight. Not lean, not soft, just solid in a way that seemed geological, like something that had been compressed over time into a denser version of itself. He had a scar across his jaw that he'd gotten in Fallujah in 2004. Not in a firefight, but in a vehicle accident that had killed 2 of the 4 men in the truck and left Hawk with the scar and a slight hearing loss in his left ear, and a complete unwillingness to discuss it, ever, with anyone. He and Dane had known each other for 11 years. They did not explain their friendship to people. It had started in a parking lot over a disagreement about a truck that had been resolved without full violence, and had somehow become, in the aftermath, something that looked like respect, and had gradually solidified into something that looked like loyalty. He dropped into the chair Dane kept near the tool bench and accepted the coffee without being asked, which was how their conversations usually started. "Tell me," Hawk said. Dane told him. Hawk listened the same way Dane had listened. Without comment, without expression, his hands wrapped around the mug, his gray-black eyes steady and still. When Dane finished, Hawk was quiet for a long moment. "Storage unit," he said finally, circled on a hand-drawn map. She drew the windshield crack 17 times. Another silence. "How old?" 10. Hawk turned the coffee mug in his hands. A slow rotation, just the hands doing something while the rest of him decided something. Dane knew better than to push. "Miles and Boone," Hawk said. "That's what I was thinking." "Boone's going to hate the early mornings." "Boone hates everything in the morning. He still gets up." Hawk stood. He was the kind of man who stood up from chairs the way people stood up from things they'd decided. Final, no adjustment, already moving to the next thing. He set the mug on the bench. "You called the police," he said. "Twice. They've got the documentation. They said they'll look into it, but the protocol requires—" "Right," Hawk said. The single syllable carried everything both of them had learned over a combined 70-plus years about what protocol meant when a child was afraid. He picked up his helmet. 6 a.m. 5:30. "I want to have eyes on the bus stop before he's there." Hawk nodded. He walked out into the night. His engine turned over in the dark, loud and settled, and then he was gone, and the sound of him faded, and the garage went quiet, except for the pigeons and the distant traffic, and the particular silence that followed a decision being made. Miles Keegan was the one most people were surprised by. This was because Miles looked like someone's friendly uncle. Thick beard going red to silver, round face, eyes that crinkled at the corners, a laugh that came out of him unexpectedly in situations where laughing seemed wrong, like a nervous system quirk he'd never fully corrected. He had been, before, the best street-level intelligence gatherer in 4 counties, which was a skill set that translated poorly to legitimate employment and very well to sitting in parked cars watching things and not being noticed. He arrived at the garage at 5:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning with a cardboard tray of 4 coffees and 3 breakfast burritos wrapped in foil and grease-stained paper bags. "Boone's not here yet," Dane said. "Boone's always almost not here," Miles said, putting the tray on the workbench. "He'll be here." Boone Cutter arrived at 5:22, which was not late, but was the exact amount of time that communicated that he'd considered not coming right up until the moment he didn't not come. He was the youngest of them at 36, the tallest by 2 inches, and carried the specific physical tension of a man who had never fully convinced his body that the war, whatever war, there had been more than one, there were always more than one, was actually over. He had a daughter of his own, 7 years old. He saw her on alternate weekends and every other holiday and paid his child support on time. And her name was something he didn't say in front of people because saying it made his face do something he couldn't control. He took the coffee Miles handed him and didn't say good morning. Dane spread the sketchbook open on the workbench. He'd borrowed it from Avery the previous afternoon with a promise to return it undamaged, and she'd handed it over with the careful trust of someone who understood exactly what they were entrusting. He walked them through it page by page, the same way she'd walked him through it. The times, the routes, the windshield crack, the 4 circled storage facilities. Boone leaned forward at the storage unit page. "She mapped the turn," he said. It wasn't a question. "She was on a school bus," Dane said. "Limited visual range, moving vehicle. She used what she had." Boone looked at the drawing for a moment. Something moved across his face and then didn't. "Kid's smarter than the vice principal," Miles said. "Kid's smarter than most people," Hawk said. "So what's the play?" Boone asked, and his voice was flat and even in the way that voices were flat and even when they were working hard to sound like they weren't personally involved. Dane looked at him. at the set of his jaw, at the coffee mug that Boone was holding slightly too tightly. "Surveillance first," Dane said carefully. "We watch, we follow, we document. We give the police something they cannot ignore." "And if the police keep ignoring?" Boone asked. "Then we have a different conversation." Boone held his gaze for one more second and then looked away, out through the open garage door at the dark street and the one working streetlight on Tanner Spur and the pre-dawn sky that was just barely beginning to shift from black to the dark blue that came before anything else. "Bus stop is at 7:22, Dane said. "Let's go." The four of them left Tanner Spur at 5:47 a.m., with their headlights still cutting through the last of the dark, engines running at the quiet end of their range. They were not loud when they didn't want to be. This was something people misunderstood about the kind of men who rode these bikes. They assumed the noise was the identity, that if you took the noise away, you took the man. But the noise had always been secondary. What the bikes gave you wasn't volume. It was the feeling of moving through the world at the exact speed of your own choosing, the ground 3 inches below you, everything stripped away except the road and the weight of what you were carrying. Dane took the lead. Hawk rode his flank. Miles and Boone fell back in a natural 2-car spread that looked from the right distance like 4 riders who happened to share the same general direction and nothing more. The bus stop on Cortez Street was empty when they arrived. They parked on the parallel street, Edison Loop, 1 block east, and walked to positions that gave them sight lines to the stop without being visible from the approach route. This was not something they'd discussed in any detail. They'd arranged themselves through a kind of muscle memory that predated the garage and the coffee and the years of trying to be ordinary men in an ordinary world. They waited. At 7:02, Avery Cross appeared at the end of Cortez Street with her backpack and her too careful walk. She sat on the bench, the good end. She didn't take out the sketchbook this time. She just watched. At 7:08, the charcoal sedan came around the corner off Delgado Street. Boone made a sound in his throat so quiet it was barely sound at all, because the sedan did exactly what Avery had documented. It moved at the specific speed of something that had been doing this long enough to be comfortable. It parked exactly 40 feet east. The driver didn't look at the bus stop directly. He looked slightly past it, the practiced gaze of someone who had learned to watch without appearing to watch. Miles had his phone out. He was not filming, obviously. The angle was casual, elbow on knee, the screen tilted. But he got the rear plate, the make and model, the parking position. "Same crack," Hawk said very quietly, without moving. "Same car," Dane confirmed. They stayed completely still. They did not move when the bus arrived. They did not move when Avery got on and the sedan sat for another 2 minutes after the bus pulled away, which was something she hadn't been able to document because she'd been on the bus. 2 minutes. The driver sat there for 2 minutes after the children were gone, and during those 2 minutes he wrote something in what appeared to be a notebook. The cold of the early morning was real cold. Southern California, November. The dry kind that came off the hills before the sun had time to fix it, that got into the joints and made old injuries announce themselves. Boone's hands were flat on his knees. "He's writing it down," Miles said. "He's been doing this longer than the girl knows," Hawk said. That landed in the silence between the four of them and stayed there. They found the storage unit on the second day. Miles drove it. The follow, the route, the turn off Garrison Avenue, the 6-block radius, while Hawk and Boone watched from further back and Dane waited at a coffee shop on Miramar, where he could see 2 blocks of the main road. It took Miles 4 hours of patient circling, the right kind of slow, the kind that looked like someone running errands or killing time. The unit was at a facility called Desert Valley Storage on a service road behind a car wash, which meant the approach was obscured on 2 sides by the car wash building and on one side by a chain-link fence with a brown privacy screen that had bleached almost white in the California sun. The unit number was 117. Miles photographed the exterior approach, the access pattern, the hours of operation posted on the gate. He noted 2 things specifically. The padlock on 117 was different from the facility's standard units, newer, heavier, and the access log scanner at the gate registered an entry time at 8:15 a.m., which was 27 minutes after the bus stop vigil had ended. He called Dane from the car wash parking lot, window down, engine off. He goes straight from the bus stop to the unit, Miles said. Dane was quiet for a moment. Every morning? No way to know without watching every morning. But today? Yes, straight there. Another pause. Miles. Dane's voice had dropped into the register it went to when he was being careful with his words. What kind of padlock? Miles told him. That's not a standard storage lock, Dane said. That's a lock for something you're seriously worried about. I know, Miles said. I've got to go back to the police, Dane said. With the plate, the storage location, the access times. He stopped. This needs to be their case. I need it to be their case. Because if it's not, Miles said, then we're 4 men who followed a guy to a storage unit and took photographs of his padlock. And that's a different conversation entirely. Yeah. Miles looked at the privacy screen on the chain-link fence, at the unit marked with the weathered aluminum number 117, at the quiet of the service road and the sound of the car wash behind him and the complete ordinary neutrality of the morning. Dane, he said, the plate came back. A silence. Already? I've got a friend at the DMV. This was not something Miles had mentioned before. I made a call last night after we watched the bus stop. I needed to know. He paused. The registered owner is a Leonard Paul Greer, 47 years old. Inglewood address, which is 40 minutes from this neighborhood, which means he is not driving here for convenience or habit. Dane didn't answer immediately. His name's not in any of the sex offender databases, Miles continued, which I also checked last night. Clean record, at least clean in the visible sense. Men who do this well, Hawk said, Dane had him on speaker, don't have dirty visible records. I know, Miles said. The car wash started up behind him with a mechanical groan and the sound of rushing water. The service road stayed empty. Unit 117 sat with its heavy padlock and its secrets in the gray morning, and Miles sat with his phone in his hand and the knowledge of a name, Leonard Paul Greer, that had not existed in Avery Cross's world yesterday and now could not be taken out of it. I'm going to the police, Dane said. Tonight. All of it. They'll sit on it, Boone said. He was in the back of the call, quiet until now. They'll sit on it for 2 weeks minimum, and they'll say procedure, and they'll say unconfirmed, and they'll say, Boone. A silence. I know, Boone said. His voice was very even. I know what they'll say. I'm just telling you what they'll say. I know you know, Dane said. Let me try it right first. The call ended. Miles sat in the parking lot for 1 more minute. He looked at the gate of Desert Valley Storage. He thought about the access log and the padlock and the man who drove 40 minutes each morning to sit in a car and watch a 10-year-old girl get on a school bus and then came here, to this unit, to do whatever came next. He started the car and drove. Detective Anna Fulbright had the kind of office that told you everything about how the department thought about certain categories of crime. Small, shared, 1 window with a broken blind, located at the furthest end of the unit's hallway, adjacent to a supply closet that smelled permanently of copy toner. She had worked in crimes against children for 6 years, and she had the specific kind of tiredness that came from 6 years of seeing too much and being given too little to address it with. She looked at the sketchbook Dane put on her desk. She looked at the photographs Miles had taken. She looked at the plate registration Miles had pulled, which Dane handed over without specifying how he'd obtained it. She was quiet for a long time. This is genuinely strong observational documentation for a 10-year-old, she said. It's strong documentation for anyone, Dane said. She looked up at him. He was sitting in the chair across from her desk with his jacket over his knees and his gray eyes steady, and she'd had enough meetings with enough men to know the difference between the kind of stillness that was threatening and the kind that wasn't, and this one wasn't. Mr. Rourke, she said, I need you to understand that what I want and what I'm procedurally able to do are not always the same thing. The plate check. She stopped. Don't tell me how you got it. I need to run my own check through proper channels. The storage unit, same problem. If we go in without a warrant, he's been at it for 3 weeks that she's documented, Dane said. Possibly longer. He drives 40 minutes each way. He goes straight to the unit afterward. I understand. Detective. His voice hadn't changed, but something in the room had. I'm sitting in this office because I'm trying to do this the right way. I need to know that the right way is actually going to work. She held his gaze. She was 39 years old, and she had a son who was 8 and took the school bus on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She did not say this. She looked at the photograph of the crack in the windshield, the river shape, the fork near the top, drawn 17 times by a 10-year-old girl at a broken bus stop bench. I'll escalate it today, she said. I can get surveillance authorized within… how long? A pause. 2 to 3 days if everything moves smoothly. Dane nodded once. He stood, put his jacket back on. I'll be watching the bus in the meantime, he said. Not a threat. A statement of fact, issued clearly so there was no ambiguity about what was happening next. Fulbright looked at him. Mr. Rourke, you need to understand that if you interfere with the subject, I know exactly what I need to understand, he said. And then he was gone, and she sat with the sketchbook open on her desk and the photographs of a heavy padlock on a storage unit in a service road behind a car wash. And she picked up her phone and started making calls. That Friday, Avery came to the garage after school. She stood in the doorway again. She always came to the doorway first, like she was checking whether the air was safe before committing to the room. She'd started doing this less, Dane had noticed. The first day she'd stayed in the doorway the entire time. Now she came to the second-to-last workbench and sat on the stool she'd started calling, without naming it, her stool. My mom called the school, she said. Dane was cleaning a carburetor. He kept working. What'd they say? Torres said the police were looking into it and that they had everything under control and that she should encourage me to focus on normal activities. My mom believed him. Dane put the carburetor down. He looked at her. She wasn't crying. She had the face of someone who had already decided that crying about this particular thing was not going to help, and that decision sat on her features with a kind of dignity that was too old for her face. She's trying to protect you, Dane said. She's trying to not be scared. He didn't argue with that. I am too, Avery said. I'm scared all the time. I'm scared on the bus, and I'm scared at school, and I'm scared going to sleep. She looked at her hands. But pretending it's not there doesn't make it not there. No, he agreed. You're still watching, right? You and the others? He looked at her. He had told her carefully that he and some friends were keeping an eye on the bus route. He hadn't told her about Leonard Paul Greer. He hadn't told her about the storage unit. He hadn't told her about Fulbright or the warrant timeline or the specific thing that happened in his chest every morning when the charcoal sedan came around the corner off Delgado Street and settled into its patient watching. Yeah, he said, we're still watching. She was quiet for a moment. Why? She asked. It was the question he'd been turning over since the first night, since the phone call to Hawk, since standing in the cold on Edison Loop watching a man he'd never met do something that required no explanation to understand is wrong. He picked up the carburetor again. Because some things, he said, you just don't look away from. She thought about that. Outside, the afternoon light was doing the thing it did at this time of year, going gold and dusty over the brown hills, making the ruined warehouse roof look almost beautiful. Dane, she said. He looked up. He's been doing it longer, hasn't he? It wasn't quite a question. He set the carburetor down again. What makes you say that? Because he's not nervous. He's been doing it long enough to not be nervous anymore. Her voice was very steady. That means I wasn't the first. The garage went quiet except for the pigeons. Somewhere on the main street 2 blocks away, someone leaned on a horn and then went silent. Dane looked at Avery Cross, 10 years old, circles under her eyes, 43 pages of documentation, sitting on her stool with the knowledge of something no child should have to know, sitting on her shoulders like ballast. He wanted to tell her she was wrong. He couldn't. We're handling it, he said. I promise you we are handling it. She looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. I believe you. She believed him. And that was the thing that sat in Dane Rourke's chest the whole rest of that Friday evening, through the carburetor and the 2 oil changes and the last of the sunset and the cold coming down off the hills. Not the rage, not the fear, not the weight of what he suspected was in Unit 117 of the Desert Valley Storage Facility on the service road behind a car wash. Just a 10-year-old girl saying, I believe you, Because the thing about being believed in by someone who had every reason not to believe in anything anymore was that it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a debt. And Dane Rourke had learned, across 41 years of a life that had required many things from him, the debts of that particular kind only came in one denomination. You paid them in full, or you didn't sleep. That Saturday morning, when he pulled up to the watch position on Edison Loop at 5:30 a.m. and Hawk and Miles and Boone were already there, coffees in hand, engines cooling, breath misting in the cold air, he didn't say anything, and neither did they. They watched the empty bus stop. They watched the gray sky begin its slow shift toward morning. And on Sunday, Detective Fulbright called him with information from the storage unit preliminary that made his hand tighten on the phone and made Hawk, watching his face from across the garage, stand up slowly from his chair. "How long?" Dane asked her. A pause on the other end. "At minimum," Fulbright said carefully, "based on what we're seeing in the preliminary overview, Mr. Rourke, the documentation in that unit extends back 14 months. The garage was very quiet. "The bus route he's on now," Dane said. "Avery's bus. How long has he been on this specific route?" Another pause. "Based on the most recent materials," she said, "we believe he transferred focus to this particular route approximately 7 weeks ago." 7 weeks. Avery had started counting 19 days ago. There were 28 days she hadn't known to count. "Detective," Dane said, "when is your warrant authorization coming through?" "Tomorrow," she said, "possibly the day after." "I see." "Mr. Rourke, I need you to—" "I heard you," he said. "Tomorrow. Possibly the day after." He hung up. Hawk was standing across the garage with his arms folded and his gray-black eyes reading the room with the specific precision of a man who had spent 3 decades in situations where reading the room was the difference between walking out and not. "How long?" Hawk asked. 14 months, Dane said. 7 weeks on Avery's route. The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that formed in rooms where men who had once been very different men were working very hard to remain the men they'd decided to become. Boone turned away. He walked to the far end of the garage and stood with his back to them and his hands at his sides and said absolutely nothing, and the way he stood said everything that needed to be said about what it meant to be a father of a 7-year-old girl and to be standing in this particular garage with this particular information on a Sunday morning in November. Miles looked at the coffee in his hands. Hawk looked at Dane. "Monday morning," Dane said. "We're on the bus route. All 4 of us." Hawk nodded once. That was all. The next morning, Monday, the 5th morning of the full surveillance operation, the charcoal sedan came around the corner off Delgado Street at 7:08 a.m., and something was different. It parked in the usual spot, 40 feet east, but the engine didn't go to idle. It stayed running. Miles noticed it first. He was positioned furthest east, parked on a residential block with a view back toward the bus stop, and the sound of a running engine at a stationary distance was specific, different from the ambient traffic noise, different from the rumble of the 4 Harleys cooling a block away. He texted the group. Engine still running. They watched. At 7:19, 3 minutes before the bus was due, the sedan moved. Not away. Forward, just slightly, 10 feet, 20. Closing the distance to the bus stop with the slow and deliberate precision of something that had made a decision. Dane was on his feet before he'd consciously processed the movement. The cold air came into his lungs and his boots hit the concrete, and somewhere behind him he heard Hawk's jacket creak and Miles start moving and Boone's footsteps, quick, controlled, the footsteps of someone who had made this kind of transition from waiting to moving more times than he could count. Avery was sitting on the bench. The bus was not yet in sight. The sedan was 50 feet away and still moving forward, slowly, deliberately, the engine note unchanged, the morning light catching the long diagonal crack in the windshield like a scar opened fresh. Dane walked toward the bus stop with his hands open at his sides, and every scar, and every year, and every winter that had built him into this exact specific man burning quietly in the space between his shoulder blades. The sedan saw them. Whether it was Dane appearing first, or the sound of boots on asphalt from three directions, or the specific geometry of four men moving toward a single point from different angles. Something in the driver's posture changed, visible through the windshield, even from here. The sedan slowed, and then it stopped. And from the bench, Avery Cross looked up from her sketchbook, the sketchbook she'd started bringing again, because old habits of documentation don't die easily, and saw Dane coming toward her, and behind him the others, and she looked at the stopped sedan and then back at Dane, and the expression on her face was not relief, not yet, not quite. It was something closer to the specific held breath of someone who had been right about something terrible for 19 days and was now watching the proof arrive, all at once, in the cold morning air. The bus was 2 blocks away. The sedan was not moving. And in the quiet of the morning, between the grind of bus brakes and the rumble of 4 motorcycle engines turned cold, something was about to change in a way that no procedure or paperwork or dismissal could walk back. Leonard Paul Greer was no longer deciding whether to move. He was deciding whether to run. And the 4 men standing between him and a 10-year-old girl at a broken bench at the end of Cortez Street were very, very calmly making sure that he understood both options were now gone. The sedan didn't move. That was the thing. That was the specific thing that Dane would turn over later, in the garage alone, with the cold coffee and the carburetor he wasn't actually cleaning. The sedan didn't move. It sat there with its engine running and its cracked windshield catching the flat November light, and Leonard Paul Greer inside it, doing the calculation that men like him did when the variables of a situation shifted without warning. The bus arrived. The doors opened. Avery Cross stood up from the bench with her sketchbook clutched against her chest, and she looked at Dane. One long, level look, the kind that asked a question without words. And then she got on the bus, and the doors closed, and the bus pulled away, and the whole ordinary machinery of a school morning continued exactly as it was supposed to. The sedan sat. Dane stood on the sidewalk 10 feet from the driver's side window, with his hands open at his sides and his breath misting in the cold, and his eyes on the windshield, and behind the cracked glass, Leonard Paul Greer was a shape, a silhouette, a presence that did not yet have a face that Dane had seen clearly. Hawk came up on his left, unhurried, hands in his jacket pockets. Boone stopped on the far side of the street, leaning against a telephone pole like he'd been there all morning. Miles stayed back near the corner, his phone out, recording. Nobody spoke. The sedan's engine idled. 30 seconds, 45. Enough time for a man inside a car to understand the geometry of what had assembled around him. Not a threat, not an attack, nothing that would give him a clean story to tell. Just 4 men standing in positions that made leaving complicated without being positions that made leaving impossible. At the 50-second mark, the sedan reversed slowly, turned, and drove away in the direction it had come from. Nobody moved until it was out of sight. Then Boone crossed the street and stopped 3 feet from Dane and said, very quietly, "We should have taken the plate and walked to the window." "No," Dane said. "He knows we're watching now. He adjusts, comes back with a different car, different time. Boone, we burned the surveillance for nothing. We kept a kid safe this morning." Dane turned to look at him. "That's not nothing." Boone held the look for a moment. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working to keep his voice at its current temperature, which was cold-controlled, the way water was cold before it became ice. "We kept her safe today," he said. "Today." He walked back to his bike. Hawk watched him go. "He's not wrong," Hawk said. "I know he's not wrong," Dane said. "Come on." The call from Fulbright came at 11:15 that morning. Dane was mid-oil change on a customer's F-150, and he almost let it go to voicemail because there was a specific kind of call you learned to brace for, and her name on the screen had started to carry that weight. He picked up. "The warrant hit a procedural issue," she said, without preamble, which he respected. He straightened up from under the F-150. "What kind of issue?" "The storage facility is registered to a holding company. The holding company has 2 principals on paper, and one of them is a retired county employee." A pause. "Nobody's suggesting impropriety. It just creates a paperwork chain that has to be handled specifically, and the judge who would normally sign off on this category of warrant is out on medical leave until—" "How long?" "Wednesday. Maybe Thursday." Dane looked at the garage wall, at the calendar with the oil change schedule and the handwritten appointments. At the photograph Avery had drawn of the windshield crack that he'd folded carefully and tucked into the corner of the mirror above his tool bench, which he had not told anyone he'd done. "He was at the bus stop again this morning," Dane said. A silence from Fulbright's end. "Mr. Rourke." He sat with the engine running. He moved closer before the bus arrived. He paused. "Detective." Something shifted in his pattern this morning. "I don't know what changed, but something did." Another silence. Longer. "I need you to not do anything that would compromise. I understand the legal situation." "Do you?" It wasn't rhetorical. She was asking. He looked at the photograph of the windshield crack. "I understand it," he said. "I don't have to like it." "No," she agreed. "You don't." She hung up. He stood in the garage for a moment with the phone in his hand and the smell of motor oil and the sound of the pigeons in the ruined warehouse and the particular silence of a situation that was not resolving at the speed that a child's safety required. He heard a motorcycle turn onto Tanner Spur. Then a second. He didn't have to look to know. Boone came in first, Hawk behind him. Miles parked outside and stayed there, which was its own kind of message. Boone put both hands flat on the workbench and looked at Dane. "I ran Leonard Paul Greer," he said. Dane went still. "Boone, I have a contact at the state AG's office. Not a cop, not a detective, just someone who owes me." He said it evenly, the way you said something you'd already decided you weren't going to apologize for. "Greer has 2 prior incidents. Neither resulted in charges." The garage was quiet. "2 priors," Dane said. "One in Riverside County, 2017. Complaint from a parent. Suspicious vehicle near an elementary school. Insufficient evidence to pursue. One in San Bernardino, 2019. Similar complaint. Both times the reporting parties withdrew, or the cases got administratively closed." He lifted his hands from the bench. "Neither is in the standard criminal database. Both are in incident records that require specific access to find." Hawk was leaning against the garage wall with his arms crossed, watching both of them. "Fulbright would have found this eventually," Dane said. "Eventually," Boone said. "She's following procedure." "Dane." Boone's voice dropped, which was the more dangerous register. When he raised it, it was just volume. When he dropped it, it meant something different. "He's done this before, twice that we know about. This is not a man in the early stages of something. This is a man who knows exactly how long he can sit outside a school before the warrant paperwork catches up with him." Dane looked at him. "Which means he'll move soon," Hawk said from the wall. "Just that. The diagnosis, delivered flat." "He already moved," Boone said. "This morning. The engine running, the closing distance. That wasn't escalation for its own sake. That was a man deciding whether his window was closing. The F-150 was still up on the lift. The oil change half finished. The customer was supposed to pick it up by 2. "What are you proposing?" Dane said. Not a question exactly. A request for clarity before the argument that was coming. Boone looked at him for a long moment. "I want to go to the unit," he said. "No. Not inside. Not even close. I want to establish a watch on the unit so that if he moves anything out of it before the warrant comes through, we have documentation. Boone, if we're parked on that service road and he sees us, we burn everything Fulbright is building. If we're not on that service road and he empties the unit before Wednesday, there is no case." Boone's voice stayed level. "There is no case and he drives to the next county and the next bus route, and we are standing here in 4 years reading about it in the news." The last sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Hawk unfolded his arms and looked at the floor. Miles came in from outside. He'd been listening from the doorway. He came to the workbench and put his coffee down and said nothing, which meant he'd already decided which side of this he was on, and it wasn't automatic. "If we approach that unit," Dane said, "and Greer is there, or sees us, or calls it in, we become the story. 4 men with priors, 3 of us with priors," Miles said. "Surveilling a civilian, and suddenly the case against him has a defense attorney's argument built into it. We become reasonable doubt." Boone looked at him. "I know," he said. "Then you know why we can't." "I know why we shouldn't," Boone said. "I know exactly why. And I also know that I have a 7-year-old daughter who takes a bus on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And if there was a man who had done this twice before sitting 40 feet from her bus stop, I would need someone to tell me there was a person watching the unit. His voice was still level. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. The silence that followed was one of the worst ones. Not the silence of men who had nothing to say. The silence of men who understood each other completely and disagreed anyway. You go alone, Hawk said quietly. You're a man with a history parking on a service road behind a car wash for no documentable reason. I know. You're also the most recognizable of us, Miles said. You're 6'1". There are maybe 40 men in this county who look like you parked on that road. I know that too. Dane looked at him for a long moment. Boone looked back. The thing about Boone Cutter was that he was not reckless. That was the thing people who didn't know him misread from the outside. The size of him, the silence, the tension that lived in his shoulders. They read it as the profile of a man who acted without thinking. But he was the opposite. He was a man who thought so much, so carefully, so relentlessly, that by the time he announced what he was going to do, he had already exhausted every alternative and was telling you the conclusion, not proposing the debate. He had thought about this. He had been thinking about it since Sunday morning when Dane had said the words 14 months. 2-hour rotations, Dane said finally. Boone went still. We do it right or we don't do it, Dane said. 2-hour rotations, different vehicle each time, not bikes, too visible, rental cars if we have to. No direct approach to the unit. Documentation only. If he shows and starts moving material, we call Fulbright immediately and we back off completely. We are not there. We are never there. Hawk looked at Dane. You just decided to do the thing you were arguing against, he said. I decided to do it in a way that doesn't explode the case. Dane looked at Boone. That's the condition. Any deviation from those terms and we pull back entirely. No exceptions. Boone nodded. No exceptions, he repeated. Miles looked between them. I'll take the first rotation, he said. The service road behind Desert Valley Storage was quieter than Miles had expected for a Tuesday afternoon. 2 cars passed in the first hour, a landscaping truck and a UPS van, and neither slowed. He sat in a rented Civic the color of wet concrete, parked on the access shoulder 60 meters from the facility gate, with a view of the entrance and the approximate section of the facility where Unit 117 was located. He had a coffee that had gone cold and a podcast playing through one earphone at low volume. Not because he was listening to it, but because a man sitting in a car with one earphone in looked different from a man sitting in a car watching something. He had learned this in a different life. The details mattered. The details were the difference between visible and invisible. At 1:47 p.m., a car turned onto the service road. Silver Camry, clean plates. He noted them. He noted the single male occupant. He noted the time. The Camry went to the gate, used the access scanner, and drove inside. Miles kept his eyes on the road, not the facility entrance. You didn't look directly at things on a surveillance watch. You used your peripheral vision and let your conscious attention rest slightly to the left of what you were actually tracking. The Camry was inside for 11 minutes. When it came out, it went back the way it had come, and Miles noted the exit time and license plate and then sat very still for another minute processing what he'd seen. He called Dane. Silver Camry just made an 11-minute visit to the facility, he said. Single male. I didn't get a look at the face, wrong angle, but the plates came back registered to a Jennifer Ann Greer, Torrance address. A pause from Dane's end. Greer has family, Dane said. He has someone who shares his last name with a Torrance address, Miles said. Could be wife, sister, mother. Could be nothing. Shared facility access, family account. Or it's a second vehicle he uses. Or that, Miles said. But the Torrance address is 40 minutes south of here. Same general distance as the Inglewood address on his own registration. That's a radius, Dane. He keeps everything in the same radius around this facility. The line was quiet. I don't like that, Dane said. No, Miles said. Neither do I. He sat on the service road for another 40 minutes. Nothing else came. When Hawk arrived in a battered Subaru that Dane had borrowed from a customer, Miles handed off the watch position and drove back toward Tanner Spur with the Camry plates in his notes and the 11-minute visit duration sitting in his chest like a stone he couldn't dislodge. 11 minutes. Long enough to check that everything was still there. Not long enough to move it. Yet. The argument happened that night. It happened in the garage, which was where things between them always happened. Not in bars, not over phones, but under the flat fluorescent light, with the grease smell and the cold concrete and the Harleys parked outside clicking as their engines cooled. It was the kind of place that didn't let you perform. You were exactly what you were under that light, with the smell of work in the air, and there was nowhere to put distance between yourself and the things you were actually saying. Hawk started it. He came in at 8:30 with a paper bag of food nobody had ordered and set it on the workbench and said, without sitting down, "Miles found something." Dane looked up. Miles had come in behind Hawk. He set his phone on the bench and turned it so the screen faced Dane and Boone. The screen showed a photograph. It was not a photograph Miles had taken himself. It was a screenshot of a social media page, partially public, showing a group photo from what appeared to be a youth soccer event. 12 or 13 children, coaches, a banner. "Bottom right corner," Miles said. "Background." Dane looked. In the background of the soccer photo, partially obscured by the edge of the banner, was a charcoal sedan. The windshield crack was visible. "Where's this from?" Dane said. "A parent's public page. The soccer league plays at Garfield Park, which is 3 blocks from Avery's school," Boone said. He'd seen it first. He'd been staring at it since Miles had turned the phone over. "The photo is from 8 weeks ago," Miles said. 1 week before we now believe he transferred focus to Avery's bus route. Nobody spoke. "He was at the soccer league," Hawk said, very flat, just laying the fact in the room. "He was in the background of a soccer photo," Miles said. "We don't know what he was doing there. We don't know if he was watching a specific child or just present." "Miles," Boone said. "I know," Miles said. "I know what it looks like." What it looked like was a man who moved through spaces where children gathered and never made himself visible enough to be reported and never did anything specific enough to be arrested for, and who had been doing this for at minimum 14 months across multiple incidents in 2 prior counties, and who had now physically moved his position on the 5th day of their full surveillance. What it looked like was a man who understood timing. "We need to send this to Fulbright tonight," Dane said. "I already did," Miles said, 20 minutes ago. "Good." She called back 12 minutes later. Something in Miles's voice made Dane look at him more carefully. "She said it's useful background material," Miles said, "but that it doesn't change the warrant timeline because it doesn't establish actionable evidence of a specific threat to a specific child, which is the legal threshold for what?" Boone's voice. "For anything faster than Wednesday." The fluorescent light hummed. Outside, a car went by on the main street. Then nothing. Boone pushed himself back from the workbench and stood up straight and walked to the garage door and stood with his back to all of them looking out at the dark street and the single working light on Tanner Spur. "He was at the soccer league," Boone said. "He was talking to the dark street, not to them. He transferred to the bus route. He started running. He sent someone to the unit today to check it. We don't know that the Camry was—" "He's shutting down the operation," Boone said. "That's what this is." Something spooked him. Us, the police inquiry, something, and he's deciding how much time he has before the net closes, and he's calculating whether he can make one move before it does. Dane looked at Hawk. Hawk looked at the floor. "If that's true," Dane said carefully, "then the right response is to make sure Fulbright knows and let her accelerate the warrant through whatever channels. The judge is out until Wednesday." "There are other judges." "On a procedurally complicated warrant tied to a retired county employee's holding company," Boone said, turning around, "at 8:30 on a Tuesday night." The sentence didn't need an ending. Dane looked at him. Boone's face was not angry. That was the thing. Anger would have been easier. Anger you could argue against, could tell to wait, could walk back from the edge of with enough words. What was on Boone's face was not anger. It was the expression of a man who had finished his calculation and arrived at a conclusion and was now looking at the person he respected most and asking, without saying it, whether that person had arrived at the same conclusion by a different route. "Say it," Dane said. Boone was quiet for a moment. "I want to go to the unit tonight," he said, "not inside. I want to see what's there from the outside. I want to know if he's already started moving things, because if he has, I want to be able to call Fulbright with specific time-stamped visual documentation of activity that she can use to get an emergency warrant authorization at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. That's the reason, Dane said. What's the real reason? A silence. I want to know what's in there, Boone said. I want to know what he's been doing for 14 months, so that when I sit on that watch position tomorrow morning at 5:30 and I see that sedan come around the corner, I know exactly what I'm sitting between. The garage was very quiet. You want to know if it's Avery, Dane said, specifically, or if it was always going to be whoever was on that bus route. Boone held his gaze. I want to know what we're actually dealing with, he said, because right now we're operating on inference and we need certainty. We're operating on documented evidence and professional law enforcement. Dane, and something in the way he said it stopped the sentence, not loudly, just stopped it. I have a daughter. She's 7 years old and she has a gap between her front teeth and she cries at animal videos and she started reading chapter books last month. He paused. I don't say that to you as an argument. I say it to you so you understand why I cannot sit in this garage and wait for Wednesday. The fluorescent light hummed. Hawk looked at Miles. Miles looked at his coffee. Dane looked at Boone for a long time. If we go, he said finally, we go together. All four. 2 stay at the perimeter, 2 get eyes on the unit exterior only. We use the phone, not our eyes. Camera, maximum zoom. You don't get within 30 feet of the unit. We pull back at any sign of anyone else present. And if Fulbright calls me between now and whenever we go and tells me there's movement on the warrant, we abort, turn around, and come home. Hawk said, agreed. Miles said, agreed. Boone said nothing. He nodded once. They left at 11:15 p.m. in the borrowed Subaru and Miles's rental Civic. No motorcycles, headlights low on the surface streets. The night was cold and clear and the kind of quiet that Southern California got after 10 on weeknights. The highway traffic still audible in the distance, but the side streets dark and still, the hills above the residential neighborhoods black against a sky that was almost, but not quite, dark enough to see stars through. Nobody spoke for most of the drive. At a red light on Miramar Road, 4 blocks from the storage facility service road, Miles said, the Camry visited for 11 minutes. You said, Hawk said. 11 minutes is long enough to see that a unit is undisturbed. It's also long enough to make a decision about something. The light changed. I keep coming back to the timing, Miles said. He moved forward at the bus stop yesterday morning. The Camry visited the unit in the afternoon, both in the same day. He's sequencing, Hawk said. That's what I think. Boone, in the back seat, said nothing. They parked on the access shoulder, same position Miles had used in the afternoon. The facility was closed, the gate locked, the small office dark, the service road completely empty in both directions. The night was cold enough that their breath made brief shapes in the air when they got out. Dane looked at the facility, at the gate, at the dark section of the interior where Unit 117 would be. The padlock was visible from here if you knew where to look, and Dane had looked at Miles's photographs often enough to know exactly where to look. Even in the dark, the unit door was visible as a pale shape against the slightly darker interior wall. The padlock was not on the door. He stood very still. Miles, he said quietly. Miles had already seen it. The unit is open, Miles said. The unit door was not swinging wide. It was not obviously open. But the padlock that had been photographed carefully, 3 times from multiple angles, was not on the hasp. The door was closed, but not locked. He's been here, Boone said. Very quiet. Or he's here now, Hawk said. They stood in the cold on the service road and looked at the facility and listened. No engine sounds from inside, no movement. The gate was locked. The office was dark. The only way in was the access scanner, which would log a time. The scanner, Dane said. If he accessed the unit tonight, it'll be in the log. The log we can't access without Fulbright, Miles said. I can call her right now, Sakite. Dane, Boone's voice. The door is open. Dane looked at him. Whatever was in there, Boone said, he either moved it tonight, or he moved part of it, or he's in the process of moving it. He paused. The warrant on Wednesday morning is for a unit that may be empty by Wednesday morning. I'm calling Fulbright, Dane said. He already had his phone out. She picked up on the third ring, her voice not groggy. She hadn't been sleeping. He told her. 30 seconds, specific, without context she didn't need. Padlock removed. Unit appears open. Service Road, current time, 11:58 p.m. Her voice on the other end of the call was careful and controlled in the way that voices were careful and controlled when they were moving fast behind a steady surface. Do not touch that door, she said. We haven't touched anything. Do not go inside the facility. Do not approach the unit. If anyone arrives, I understand. I'm making calls right now. I need you to stay on that road and document anything that moves, and I will have a unit there within a pause. Something happening on her end. Within 20 minutes. She hung up. Dane looked at the others. 20 minutes, he said. They waited on the service road in the cold, the facility gate locked, the office dark, the pale shape of the unit door in the distance undone. 14 minutes into the wait, headlights appeared at the far end of the service road. Not a police cruiser. The headlights were lower, the engine note wrong. Silver Camry. It came toward them slowly, and at 50 meters it slowed, and at 30 meters it stopped. They were standing in front of the Subaru and the Civic, 4 of them, and the Camry's headlights were on them, and for 3 full seconds nothing moved in either direction. Then the Camry's reverse lights came on. Boone was moving before Dane could say his name. Not running. He didn't run. He moved the way large men moved when they'd made a decision, efficiently, covering ground without seeming to hurry, and he stepped sideways off the shoulder into the edge of the Camry's headlight beam, and he looked at the windshield. The driver was male, late 40s. The face was not clear. The headlights were in Boone's eyes, but the shape of the man in the driver's seat, the posture, the specific way the head turned when Boone stepped into the light. The Camry accelerated backward. Fast. It went backward 30 meters, threw itself into a 3-point turn in the width of the service road, and drove away. Boone stood in the road. Dane was next to him. The taillights diminished in the dark, and then were gone. Was that him? Dane said. Boone was very still. I don't know, he said. I couldn't see the face. But you think it was? A long pause. The way he turned his head, Boone said. When I stepped into the light, he stopped. He wasn't surprised to see people here. What does that mean? Boone looked at him. In the dark of the service road, with the cold off the hills and the facility gate locked behind them, and the sound of distant highway traffic, Boone's face was the face of someone who had just processed something they were still working through. He wasn't surprised, Boone said. He was checking. He came here to see if we were watching. Another pause. He already knew someone was watching. Dane went still. He knew before tonight, Boone said. The sirens were audible now. Fulbright's unit, coming from the north, still blocks away. The facility sat in its locked silence, the unit door in its undone quiet. Then he knows who we are, Hawk said from behind them. Nobody answered, because the answer was obvious and the answer changed everything. If Leonard Paul Greer had known for any length of time that 4 men were watching the bus stop in the storage unit, then his pattern shift that morning hadn't been about closing his window. It had been about opening theirs. He hadn't been deciding whether to run. He had been deciding what to do about the 4 men standing between him and the child. And somewhere in the dark, in a silver Camry on a surface street in Southern California, a man who had done this before in 2 other counties and walked away twice was making that decision right now. And they had no idea what it was. And the police cruiser was still 30 seconds out. And Avery Cross was home asleep in the house on Cortez Street, 4 blocks from the bus stop, with a broken zipper on her lunch bag and a sketchbook full of the truth that nobody had wanted to hear for 19 days. And the garage door was unlocked because her mother worked doubles and sometimes forgot. And Dane Rourke's phone was already in his hand before the thought had fully formed, dialing the number he'd gotten from the school directory without Avery knowing. The number that rang 4 times, and then went to voicemail, and he listened to Jess Cross's tired recorded voice ask him to leave a message, and he said very carefully, trying to keep every controlled and measured thing he'd built over the last 11 days in his voice. Miss Cross, this is Dane Rourke. I need you to call me back right now. I need you to make sure your doors are locked tonight. Jess Cross called back at 12:17 a.m. She'd been asleep. He could hear it in the first syllable, that specific density of a voice pulled up from the bottom of 4 hours. And then she wasn't asleep, because something in his message had done what he'd intended it to do without him having to say the specific words he hadn't wanted to leave on a voicemail. "What's happening?" she said. "Are your doors locked?" A pause. Movement sounds. Her getting up, moving through the house. "Front door's locked." "Back door?" A sound. "Back door's locked." "Avery's in her room?" "She's asleep." "Dane, what?" "Stay inside tonight. Don't open the door for anyone you don't know. I'll explain everything tomorrow morning in person, but right now I need you to stay inside with the doors locked and call me if anything feels wrong." Silence. "How wrong?" she said. Her voice had gone to a place that mothers' voices went when they understood that the fear they'd been dismissing as their child's imagination had just called them on their personal phone at 12:17 in the morning. "Wrong enough to call," he said. "That's all." She didn't argue. That was the thing about Jess Cross that Dane hadn't expected. She didn't argue. She'd been dismissing this for weeks out of exhaustion, out of necessity, out of the simple arithmetic of a woman working doubles who didn't have room for one more crisis. But the dismissal had never been refusal. It had been survival. And survival, once it understood the actual shape of the threat, adjusted. "Okay," she said. "I'll come by at 7, he said. "Before the bus." He hung up. The police unit had arrived. 2 cruisers, a plainclothes vehicle that was Fulbright, and a third car that he didn't recognize, but that parked in a way that suggested federal involvement or the specific kind of interagency presence that meant this had escalated above her pay grade without her necessarily asking it to. She came to him first. She looked at the facility gate, at the unit door, at the 4 of them standing in the cold with their breath misting. She looked at Dane. "The padlock," she said. "Not on the hasp when we arrived. We didn't touch the gate." "The vehicle." "Silver Camry. We documented the plate. Same registration we gave you yesterday. Jennifer Ann Greer, Torrance." He paused. "The driver saw us and reversed. I couldn't make the face, but Boone got closer." Fulbright looked at Boone. Boone was quiet for a moment. "Late 40s, he said. "Male. The posture and the head turn." He stopped. "I think it was him. I can't give you a positive ID." Fulbright looked at the unit door for a long moment. "The access log will tell us," she said, more to herself than to them. She turned to one of the uniforms and spoke quietly, and the uniform went to the facility office and began working on the lock. The third car's door opened. The man who got out was not in uniform. He was somewhere between 45 and 50, medium height, the kind of unremarkably dressed that was its own kind of deliberate. The clothes that meant "I am not here officially," while every movement said the opposite. He came toward Fulbright and spoke to her in a low voice with his back partially to Dane, and Dane watched Fulbright's expression while he spoke. Her expression didn't change, which meant she'd already known he was coming, which meant the escalation had happened before tonight. The access log showed 3 entries for Unit 117 that day. The first was at 1:36 p.m., the Camry's afternoon visit, 11 minutes. The second was at 9:47 p.m., 2 hours and 20 minutes before they'd arrived. The third was at 11:44 p.m., 14 minutes before they'd pulled onto the service road. 3 visits in one day. The man from the third car, he gave his name as Carver, just Carver, no title that stuck, stood with Fulbright and looked at the access log on the facility manager's computer screen. And Dane watched from the service road through the office window and understood from the set of their shoulders that what they were reading was not a surprise to either of them. Hawk came up beside him. "Who is Carver?" Hawk said quietly. "Federal," Dane said. "My guess." "He knew Greer." "He knew about Greer before tonight." "Before tonight," Hawk repeated. He let the weight of that sit for a moment. Which means Fulbright got a call that wasn't procedure. That was someone managing information. Dane said nothing. Which means, Hawk said even more quietly, that the warrant wasn't slow because of a retired county employee's holding company. The cold came off the hills in a long, flat push. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train was doing something complicated on the rail line 2 miles east. the sound of it carrying across the flat residential dark. Dane looked at the office window, at Carver's back. "No," he said. "It wasn't." Fulbright came to them at 1:45 a.m. She looked tired in a specific way. Not the tired of a late night, but the tired of someone who had been carrying information they weren't supposed to carry and had just had the weight of it increased without warning. She looked at Dane. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Off the record, and I mean that in the specific legal sense, none of what I'm about to say can be documented as having come from me." Dane waited. "Leonard Paul Greer has been a person of interest in a federal investigation for 11 months, she said. "Not this specific activity. A connected financial network. I don't know the full scope. What I know is that someone in the federal structure flagged this case when my warrant request went through, because my request activated a notification system that was already attached to his name." Dane looked at her. "The warrant wasn't delayed because of the holding company," he said. "The holding company issue is real," she said, "but it was convenient." She paused. "Someone needed time to decide how to handle a state-level warrant intersecting with a federal monitoring situation." "They've been watching him," Hawk said. "Monitoring an associated financial network," Fulbright said. "Which is different from watching him. It means someone knew his name was connected to something and was following the money and the specific activity." She stopped. "The specific activity with the children may not have been the primary focus of the federal interest." The silence that followed this sentence was one of the worst Dane had ever stood inside. "They were watching the money," Boone said. His voice was very flat. "And while they were watching the money, he was—" "I don't know the full timeline," Fulbright said. "I'm telling you what Carver told me in the last 20 minutes, which is not everything he knows." Boone turned and walked away from the group. Not far, just to the edge of the service road, where the gravel met the dry scrub at the shoulder. He stood with his back to them, and his hands at his sides and the cold working at the back of his neck, and he said nothing. "The unit," Dane said. "The unit is being processed as a federal scene now," Fulbright said. "My warrant becomes secondary. They're taking jurisdiction." "What does that mean for Greer?" "It means the investigation is now significantly larger than a state-level surveillance case." She paused. "Which should mean more resources, faster action. Or it means he disappears into a federal process while the specific danger to Avery Cross gets subordinated to a larger case strategy," Dane said. Fulbright looked at him. She didn't deny it. "I will do everything within my authority," she said carefully, "to ensure that the immediate safety concern is addressed as the primary priority. I'm telling you, this situation has become more complicated than either of us anticipated." Dane looked at her for a long moment. "The Camry," he said. "The driver. Is he Greer?" "The access log confirms a badge registered to Leonard Greer at 9:47 and 11:44 p.m., she said. "The 1:45 entry is registered to a secondary badge on the account, Jennifer Greer." So the afternoon visit was Jennifer, and tonight was Greer. Twice. She paused. "He came back. An hour after the first visit, he came back." "Because he forgot something," Hawk said. "Or because he was checking whether anyone had been there after his first visit." "Or both," Miles said. Fulbright looked at each of them in turn. "Go home," she said. "Get off this road. I'll have a unit on Cortez Street by 6 a.m. "I'll be there at 5:30, Dane said. She looked at him. "Mr. Rourke, I'll be there at 5:30, he said again. Not confrontational, just factual. The statement of a man who had decided something in the same complete and finished way that Boone decided things, and for whom the next argument was the same as no argument. She held his gaze for one more second. Then she walked back toward the facility office and Carver and the federal scene that was consuming the service road behind a car wash, where a man had kept something in a padlocked unit for 14 months. They drove back in silence. Not the silence of men with nothing to say, the specific silence of men who had too much to say and had learned over too many difficult years that some of it needed to sit in the dark for a while before it became words. Boone rode with Dane in the Subaru. He'd said nothing since the service road. He sat in the passenger seat with his elbow on the window ledge and his hand over his mouth and his eyes on the road ahead, and Dane didn't push. They were 3 blocks from Tanner Spur when Boone spoke. 11 months, he said. Dane kept his eyes on the road. They had his name for 11 months, Boone said. Some office somewhere had Leonard Paul Greer attached to a financial network flag, and they were watching the money, and somewhere in those 11 months He stopped. Started again. He was at Garfield Park. He was on bus routes. He was in that unit building, whatever he was building. He paused. And nobody connected it because nobody was looking at that part of him. They were looking at the money. I know, Dane said. Kids, Boone said. The word came out different from all the others, quieter, more precise, like something that had been stripped of everything except its actual weight. The thing in that unit, that's what it was. Dane didn't answer because there was no answer. The two priors, Boone said, Riverside and San Bernardino. Did anybody in the federal structure know about those? I don't know. If they did, Boone. If they did and they still sat on it, Boone. His voice was harder now, not angry at Boone, angry at the thing Boone was correctly describing. I can't go there tonight. We cannot go there tonight. Tomorrow, yes. We push Fulbright, we push Carver, we document everything, we make noise. Tonight I need you to go home and sleep for 4 hours because we are back on Cortez Street at 5:30. A silence. She's 10 years old, Boone said. I know. My daughter's 7. I know that too. Boone put his hand back over his mouth and looked at the road and said nothing else until they reached the garage. Dane didn't sleep. He went through the motions of it, horizontal, eyes closed, the garage's back room that he used when he worked late enough that going home to the apartment on Sutter Street felt like a waste of time. Cot, wool blanket, a shelf with 3 books he'd been reading for 2 years. The sound of the ruined warehouse pigeons settling, then going quiet. He lay in the dark and thought about the access log. 2 visits from Greer in one night, the first at 9:47, the second at 11:44. Return trips. A man who had come back to his unit not once but twice in 2 hours, which meant he'd left the first time and thought of a reason to return, and the reason he'd returned at 11:44 was either that he'd forgotten something or that he'd decided something during the hour between visits. What did a man decide in an hour that made him return to a storage unit at midnight? Dane looked at the ceiling. The photograph of the windshield crack was in the garage, not in here. He'd put it on the tool bench mirror where he could see it while working. But he didn't need to look at it. He had drawn it in his head enough times that it was simply there, the way certain things became part of the geography of your interior landscape and stayed. A river shape, splitting near the top. He thought about Avery on the bench, the sketchbook, the 43 pages. He thought about Carver's back turned toward them in the facility office. He thought about 11 months. At 4:15 a.m., he got up, made coffee, sat at the workbench. At 4:47, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. He answered. Mr. Rourke. The voice was Carver's, flat, measured, the cadence of someone who had made many phone calls at many bad hours and had stopped registering the time as information. I got your number from Detective Fulbright. I need to ask you something. Dane put the coffee down. Ask, he said. The girl, Carver said. Avery Cross. Do you know who her father is? The garage was very quiet. I know her mother's name, Dane said carefully. Jess Cross. I don't know the father. His name was Derek Cross, Carver said. Was, past tense. He died 18 months ago. Car accident in Barstow. A pause. Before he died, Derek Cross testified in a federal grand jury proceeding as a cooperating witness against a financial network operating in 3 Southern California counties. Dane's hand tightened on the phone. The network, he said, the one Greer is connected to. Greer was not a principal in that case. He was a peripheral figure, known to the network, used occasionally, not central enough to be named in the proceeding. Another pause. But he was present at one of the meetings that Derek Cross described in his testimony. His name appears in the record. Dane stood up. Avery's father testified against people Greer was connected to, he said. 18 months ago, Carver said. Derek Cross died 14 months ago. The number landed like a physical thing, 14 months. The same number as the documentation in the storage unit. Greer started this, Dane said, and his voice came out very careful and very even. 14 months ago, 1 month after Derek Cross died. That's correct. This was never random, Dane said. It was never just pattern behavior, opportunity, a predator moving between bus routes. He stopped. He was sent, or he chose her specifically, because of who her father was. We don't know the full scope of Carver. He said the name the way Boone said things, with the weight of a conclusion at the end of a long calculation. Is Avery Cross in danger tonight? Specific, immediate, tonight. A silence that was 3 seconds long and felt like considerably more. We believe Greer's behavior has shifted from documentation to potential action, Carver said. The 2 visits tonight suggest he's either closing down the operation before exposure or escalating toward a specific event. Another pause. We have a unit on Cortez Street as of 20 minutes ago. I'll be there at 5:30, Dane said. Mr. Rourke? I'll be there at 5:30, he said, for the 3rd time, to the 3rd person, and hung up. He stood in the garage under the fluorescent light with the cold coffee and the smell of grease and the photograph of the windshield crack in the mirror, and for a long moment he didn't move. Then he picked up his phone and called Hawk. Hawk answered on the 2nd ring, which meant he hadn't slept either. Get Miles and Boone, Dane said. Now. Don't wait until 5:30. Come now. What happened? Avery's father was a federal witness, against the network Greer is connected to. He paused. This was never about a bus route. Hawk, this was always about her. The line was silent for 4 full seconds. I'm calling them now, Hawk said. He hung up. Dane looked at the garage wall, at the calendar and the oil change schedule, and the tools arranged in their specific order, and the life he had built here, quietly, across 7 years, out of a before that he did not discuss. He thought about a man who had spent 14 months building a case inside a storage unit. He thought about the 2 visits in one night. He thought about a 7-year-old girl with a gap in her teeth who cried at animal videos, and a 10-year-old girl with 43 pages of truth that nobody had wanted to hear, and he thought about what it meant that those 2 girls existed in the same world as Leonard Paul Greer and the network behind him. And he thought about what he was and what he had been and the specific distance between those 2 things. A distance he had worked for 7 years to maintain, and that was now, in the cold and the fluorescent light and the 4:57 a.m. dark outside the garage window, asking him exactly how committed he was to keeping it. He put on his jacket. He picked up his keys. He stood at the garage door for 1 moment, looking back at the workbench, at the photograph in the mirror, at the coffee going cold. He had told Avery Cross, some things you just don't look away from. He walked out into the dark and started his bike, and the engine came up loud and settled, and he pulled out of Tanner Spur onto the main street and rode toward Cortez Street through the black pre-dawn cold, and he did not look back, and the city moved around him with its sleeping weight and its indifferent streets and its specific November darkness. And somewhere ahead of him, 4 blocks from a broken bench at a bus stop, a 10-year-old girl was sleeping in a house with a locked door, and the man outside her life had been placed there not by accident but by design. And Dane Rourke was riding through the dark toward that house with the particular focused calm of someone who had decided, finally and completely, that the distance between what he was and what he had been was going to have to get a little shorter before the morning was done. The cold hit him the moment he turned onto Cortez Street. Not the weather cold. That had been there since midnight, the dry November kind that came off the hills and got into the seams of your jacket and stayed. This was a different cold, the kind that lived in the space between what you expected to find and what you actually found when you turned the corner and your headlight swept the street and everything that was supposed to be there wasn't. The police unit Carver had promised was gone. Not moved, gone. The curb in front of the Cross house was empty. The street was empty. The one working streetlight at the Cortez and Garrison intersection was doing its job, casting its flat yellow circle on the asphalt, and inside that circle there was nothing that should not have been there, and nothing that should have been there was. Dane killed the engine. He sat on the bike in the dark for 3 full seconds, which was long enough to confirm that his eyes were reading the street correctly, that there was no cruiser parked at the far end of the block or around the corner on Garrison. Long enough to feel the specific quality of the silence, not the silence of an empty street at 5 a.m., but the silence of a street that had recently had something in it and now didn't. He called Carver. No answer. He called Fulbright. 4 rings. The unit on Cortez, he said, before she'd finished saying his name. They're there, she said. I confirmed them at, they're not here. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell him she was pulling up something on a screen. They radioed in a block check 20 minutes ago. Detective, his voice was flat. The street is empty. I'm sitting on it right now. The pause this time was different. Don't move, she said. I'm calling it in right now. He hung up. He looked at the cross house. Dark. All windows dark. The front door closed. The small porch light was on. A yellow bug light, the kind that lasted forever because nobody ever changed them until they burned out. Everything about the house looked exactly the way a house looked at 5 a.m. when everyone inside was asleep and nothing was wrong. He got off the bike. He crossed the street. He was at the porch steps when Hawk's headlight appeared at the far end of Cortez, followed immediately by Miles, followed by Boone, and he registered their arrival the way you registered things that were necessary without being surprising. And he raised one hand to signal slow, lights off, and Hawk killed his headlight and the others did the same, and they came up quiet and parked along the curb and came to him without speaking. He looked at Hawk. Hawk looked at the house. Carver pulled the unit, Hawk said, or someone pulled it for him. Same thing. Boone was already looking at the adjacent side street, Crawford Alley, a narrow service lane that ran behind the residential block, connecting Cortez to the next street east. He was looking at the dark entrance of it with the focused, complete attention of a man whose nervous system had been trained to notice which parts of a dark space were darker than they should be. Boone, Dane said quietly. Car in the alley, Boone said. No lights. Wrong place to park unless you're waiting. Dane looked. He couldn't see it from here. Boone had 4 inches of height on him, and the angle from the far end of the porch was slightly better. Can you make the plates? Dane said. No, too dark. Miles had his phone out, camera up, maximum zoom. He looked at the screen for a moment. Charcoal, he said. The word dropped into the cold air and stayed there. Not silver. Not the Camry. Charcoal. The original car. The car with the cracked windshield. The car that Avery Cross had documented for 19 days. The car that had been the beginning of all of it. The first thing in the first page of the sketchbook. The river-shaped crack above the mirror. He switched back, Hawk said. He switched back, Dane confirmed. They stood for one moment on the porch of the cross house and looked at each other in the dark, and in that moment something finished shifting between them. Whatever had been held in tension since the garage, since the service road, since Boone's. He's done this before, and Dane's careful procedural restraint and the 11 months of federal monitoring and Carver's voice at 4:57 a.m. It shifted and settled, and what replaced it was simpler and cleaner and considerably more dangerous. Dane knocked on the door. Jess Cross answered in 30 seconds, which meant she'd been awake. She came to the door in her work clothes, still in them, which meant she hadn't slept at all. And she looked at Dane and then at the 3 men behind him on the porch, and her face did something complicated and then went still. He called, she said. Dane looked at her. Greer, she said. Leonard Greer. She said the name like something she'd been holding in her mouth since before Dane had arrived. He called my phone 2 hours ago, my personal cell. He said, she stopped, swallowed. He said Derek's debts didn't disappear when Derek did. The porch light caught her face. 43 years old, working doubles at the care home, the specific exhaustion of a woman who had been surviving alone for too long and had just discovered the specific shape of the thing that had been following her daughter to school. He knows where you live, Dane said. He called my phone, Dane. He called it from a number I didn't recognize, and he said her name. Her voice broke on the last 2 words, not into crying, but into the register underneath crying, the one that came when the body understood something before the mind was ready. He said Avery's name. Boone made a sound behind Dane, barely audible, just breath through the nose. Where is she? Dane said. Asleep. I didn't wake her. Jess looked past him at the street. There was a police car here 2 hours ago, It left. I know. Why did it leave? Working on that, he said. Right now I need you and Avery to get in a car and go to the home of someone you trust who doesn't live on this street. Family, friend, anyone. Text me the address when you get there. Can you do that? She looked at him. Avery trusts you, she said. I know. She's been telling me for 3 weeks, and She stopped. Jess. He made his voice the thing it needed to be. Not soft, not hard, just the voice you used with someone who needed to move and was one sentence away from collapsing into the weight of everything they hadn't done. There's time for that later. Right now I need you to get her up and get in your car. Back door. Go to whoever comes to mind first. She looked at him for one more second. Then she turned and went inside, and he heard her footsteps on the stairs and the low sound of a child being woken gently in the dark. He turned to the others. Allie, he said. They came at it from both ends simultaneously, which was not something they discussed, but something they did, because 11 years of various configurations of these 4 men doing difficult things in difficult spaces had built a grammar between them that didn't require words. Hawk and Miles took the Garrison Street entrance. Dane and Boone took the Cortez end. The alley was 12 feet wide, concrete, service bins on the left side behind the residential properties, a low chain-link fence on the right bordering a commercial lot. The charcoal sedan was parked a third of the way in from the Cortez end, facing Garrison, nose out, engine off, no lights. Dane came around the corner and stopped. The sedan was empty. He felt it before he confirmed it. The particular quality of stillness that a car had when there was no one in it, a subtle absence of occupied weight. He came forward 3 steps, angle-checking the interior through the windshield, and yes, empty. Both seats. The back. He's out, he said. Boone was already looking at the fence line, at the service bin positions, at the shadows between the bins and the back fence of the cross property. How long was between Jess's call and us arriving, Boone said. 2 hours. He could have been here for 2 hours. He's not in the alley, Hawk said, coming from the Garrison end. Checked both sides. Then he went over, Dane said. They looked at the fence between the alley and the cross backyard. 4 feet of chain link, the post anchors old and slightly loose. A man who'd been doing this for 14 months would have assessed that fence within the first 5 minutes of arriving. Dane's phone buzzed. Text from Jess. We're out, going to my sister on Palmetto, 3824 Palmetto. He exhaled. He texted back. Stay there. Don't open door for anyone. He looked up at the others. They're out, he said. Boone looked at the fence. He doesn't know that yet, he said. The sentence moved through the cold air, and the 4 of them understood it simultaneously. Greer had been here, had watched the house, had possibly been watching since before Dane arrived, and if he was still in the vicinity, he did not yet know that the house was empty, which meant he was either in the backyard already, or approaching it, or waiting for the specific window of early morning that he had calculated and documented and prepared for across 14 months. We call Fulbright, Dane said, right now. She gets units here and... His phone rang. Fulbright. He answered. The unit on Cortez was pulled by a federal order, she said, without preamble. 45 minutes ago. Someone in Carver's chain of command issued a tactical hold. They wanted Greer mobile. They wanted to see where he went before moving in. They were using the absence of the unit as bait to... She stopped. It went wrong. They lost visual on him 6 blocks from the storage facility. The alley was very quiet. They lost him, Dane said. 40 minutes ago. I found out 4 minutes ago. Her voice was tight. Where are you? Crawford Alley behind Cortez Street. His car is here. He's not in it. A sharp sound from her end. Get off that street, she said. Right now, I am 2 minutes out. Movement. Not in the alley. Above it, the sound of something shifting weight on the other side of the cross backyard fence. The specific sound of a person trying to be quiet and not entirely succeeding, and Dane's hand came up and the others froze, because sound discipline in situations like this was not a thing you decided on. It was a thing that lived in the body. The sound stopped, then started again. Coming back over the fence. Dane moved to the left, into the gap between two service bins, with the specific economy of a man who had spent enough of his life in situations where speed and silence were the same thing. Hawk went right. Miles stayed at the garrison entrance, visible, deliberate, a position, not an accident. Boone did not move toward a position at all. Boone stood in the center of the alley, directly in the path of the fence, and waited. The man came over the fence at the point where the post was loosest, the way anyone would who had tested the fence earlier and cataloged the information. He dropped to the alley concrete and straightened and found himself looking at Boone Cutter from a distance of 8 feet. Leonard Paul Greer was not the man Dane had constructed in his head across 3 weeks of documentation and storage units and access logs and the cold voice phone calls in the middle of the night. He was average. Medium height, medium build, the kind of face that vanished into crowds, the kind that witnesses couldn't describe specifically afterward because there was nothing specific to describe. He was wearing a dark jacket and dark pants, and he had a phone in one hand and something else in the other hand that Dane clocked in the first half second, and then Hawk clocked, and then the entire temperature of the alley changed. Not a weapon. A lanyard with a key card on it, the kind of key card that opened a door from the outside without knocking. In the other hand, a phone with its screen on showing a photograph. Avery's school photo, the kind that schools sent home in paper envelopes in October, the kind that a man with access to certain networks could obtain without ever setting foot in the school. Boone looked at the key card. He looked at the phone. He looked at Leonard Paul Greer. "Put it down," Boone said. His voice was so controlled it was almost nothing, just shape and meaning with all the volume removed. "Put both of them down on the ground." Greer's eyes went to his left, where Dane was between the bins. To his right, where Hawk had materialized from the dark. To the garrison entrance where Miles stood in the open under the streetlight. He was fast. Dane hadn't expected that. He'd expected the freeze response, the recalculation, the man who operated in shadows and planning and documentation, finding himself in a space that wasn't any of those things. He hadn't expected fast. Greer went left, toward the service bin gap, toward Dane, because Dane was the smallest gap in the geometry, and men in crisis ran toward the smallest gap. He hit the bin with his shoulder because the gap was smaller than it looked, and the impact made a sound, metal and weight, and Dane was already moving, and they met in the space between the bins, and it was short and ugly and physical, and Dane got a hand on the jacket, and Greer spun out of it with the specific practice motion of someone who had anticipated this possibility enough to prepare for it. He made 4 steps toward the Cortez end. Boone was there. He'd moved in the time it took Greer to turn, covered the distance with the long, unhurried stride of someone who had stopped hurrying years ago because he was always going to arrive before the other person expected him to. And he planted himself at the alley, mouth in the flat yellow spill of the Cortez streetlight, 6'1" and still, with his hands at his sides and his eyes on Greer and the specific quality of presence that did not require volume or movement to communicate everything it needed to communicate. Greer stopped, 8 feet. He looked at Boone. He looked at the phone in his own hand, Avery's photograph, and something moved through his expression that was not guilt and not fear, but a specific variety of calculation, the kind that happened when a man who had been very careful for a very long time was assessing his remaining options. "She's not in there," Dane said from behind him. He was breathing harder than he wanted to be, the shoulder where he'd taken the bin impact sending a hot signal up his neck that he was ignoring. "She's gone. You made a phone call 2 hours ago, and you told a woman her daughter's name, and now both of them are somewhere you can't find." Greer turned slowly to look at him. In the alley, with the flat service light and the cold, and the 4 of them arranged at their cardinal points, his face was fully visible for the first time. Average, the way he'd looked from the bus stop. Ordinary. The kind of ordinary that was its own specific kind of terrible. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Greer said. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Dane said. "Not me," Greer said. "The people behind me. The people who—" He stopped, looked at the phone in his hand. Her father made a choice. He made a choice, and he made statements, and he thought that was the end of it. It's never the end of it. "Put the phone down," Boone said. Still that same flat register. "There are people who paid for what Derek Cross did," Greer said. And those people have a very specific understanding of how debts work. He looked at Dane. And they know about you now. All four of you. Your names, your garage, your plates. They've known since Tuesday morning. The alley went very quiet. Hawk, from the right side, said nothing. His stillness had changed texture. The stillness of a man absorbing information that was changing the shape of the problem. Since Tuesday, Miles said from the garrison end. Not a question. You were visible, Greer said. You were always visible. You thought you were watching, but you were... He stopped. His eyes moved to the phone again, reflexively, the way they'd been moving since he dropped from the fence. This isn't finished because you stopped me tonight. You understand that. You think you've protected her. You've made her more visible to people with considerably more resources than I have. Sirens. Audible now. Fulbright, coming from the north, 2 vehicles by the sound of it. Greer heard it. His expression went through its calculation one more time. Put the phone on the ground, Boone said. Greer looked at him. Your daughter's name is Sophie, Greer said. She plays soccer on Saturdays. The alley ceased to have temperature. Boone's face did not change. Not a single muscle. His breathing didn't change. His hands at his sides didn't change. But something happened in his eyes that Dane had never seen there before, and hoped, very specifically, never to see again. The lights going off in a very precise way, the way lights went off in a house when someone had finally finished deciding something that had been undecided for a very long time. He crossed the 8 feet to Greer in 3 steps, and he took the phone out of Greer's hand with a grip that left no ambiguity about the available alternatives, and then he held the phone up and looked at the screen, at Avery's October school photograph, and his jaw worked once. He looked at Greer. Sophie doesn't take the bus, Boone said. Then he stepped back, phone in hand, and Greer was standing in the alley with nothing left to bargain with, and the sirens were close now, and Hawk had moved to block the garrison entrance as backup to Miles, and Dane was behind Greer with the bin impact still burning in his shoulder, and the charcoal sedan sat at the alley's curve with its cracked windshield catching the distant service light like a scar. The sirens hit the block. Red and blue started pulsing off the alley walls. Greer looked at Dane. The network doesn't stop, he said. One arrest doesn't... I know, Dane said. Then you know tonight doesn't... I know, Dane said again. Tonight's not about ending it. Tonight's about making sure she wakes up tomorrow. Fulbright came around the Cortez end with 2 uniforms behind her and stopped when she saw the configuration. Greer, 4 bikers, the specific quality of a situation that had resolved itself before the law arrived and was now simply waiting for the law to catch up. She looked at Dane. He held her gaze. She looked at Boone, who was holding the phone with Avery's photograph on the screen, his arm extended toward the nearest uniform without being asked, transferring the evidence with a precision that was the last piece of control he was going to be able to maintain for the next several minutes. The uniform took the phone. Greer said nothing more. He stood in the alley with the red and blue moving over his ordinary face, while Fulbright read him his rights in the flat professional cadence of a woman who had waited too long for this particular moment and was not going to let the weight of it compromise the procedure. And the sound of it moved through the cold air, and the pigeons somewhere in the dark city were doing something, and the freight train 2 miles east was still running, everything ordinary, everything continuing, the world not pausing for the arrest of a man who had spent 14 months building a case against a 10-year-old girl whose father had told the truth. Dane watched them put Greer in the cruiser. He watched the door close. He looked at the charcoal sedan with its river-crack windshield parked at the alley curve, and he thought about 43 pages of documentation, and he thought about a school photo in October that a man had on his phone at 5 in the morning in an alley in November. And he thought about the network that Greer had mentioned with such specific confidence, the people behind him, the people who had known about the garage and the plates since Tuesday morning, and he understood, with the particular clarity of a man standing in an alley at 5 a.m. with a bruised shoulder and cold hands, that Greer had told the truth about that part. Tonight was not the end. Boone came up beside him. They stood looking at the alley, the cruiser, the dissolving red-blue light. Sophie doesn't take the bus, Dane said. No, Boone said, but she's in a soccer league. Boone looked at the ground for a moment. Yeah, he said. She is. Dane looked at him. The weight of the next question and the next answer and the next series of days that were going to be required to deal with a network that had known their names since Tuesday and had resources considerably beyond one man with a charcoal sedan and a padlocked storage unit. All of it settled onto the alley and the cold and the two men standing in it, and neither of them said anything else, because there wasn't anything else to say right now, and the sirens were fading and the dawn was not yet started, but was somewhere in the east deciding to begin. And Hawk was talking to Fulbright near the Cortez entrance, and Miles was on his phone doing what Miles did, and the city went on around them the way cities went on, indifferent and continuous, and the dawn came. The way dawn came after nights like that, not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, just a slow gray insistence at the eastern edge of the sky that pushed the dark back by degrees until the dark was simply gone and the world was left with whatever the night had made of it. Dane sat on the curb at the Cortez end of Crawford Alley and watched the last of the police vehicles leave. Fulbright was the last to go. She stood by her car for a moment and looked at him, and he looked at her and she said, "I'll call you at 9. There are things to go through." "I know," he said. "The network situation? I know," he said again. She held his gaze for a moment more, and in her face he could see the same thing he felt in his own chest. Not satisfaction, not relief, not the clean completion of a thing done right. Something more worn than that. The feeling of a problem solved at its most visible point, while its deeper roots stayed in the dark and kept growing, and the knowledge that you had done what you could do tonight, and that tonight's doing would have to be enough for now. She got in her car and drove. He stayed on the curb. Behind him, Hawk sat on the hood of the borrowed Subaru with his arms folded and his eyes on the street. Miles was on his phone, had been since the cruiser left, the specific concentrated focus of a man running down information threads while they were still warm. Boone was standing at the alley entrance looking at the charcoal sedan, which would be towed in an hour, which would be processed and logged and entered into the federal chain of evidence and would eventually become exhibit something or other in a case that would take 2 years to come to trial. Boone was looking at the windshield crack, just looking at it. Dane watched him look at it for a long moment, and then he stood up from the curb, and his shoulder reminded him about the service bin, and he went to stand beside Boone. "River shape," Boone said. "Splits near the top." "Yeah." She drew it right. His voice was flat, not empty. Flat in the way that contained rather than excluded, the way a dam was flat on its face while holding back enormous weight. "She drew everything right," Dane said. Boone was quiet for a moment. "Sophie's mother," he said. "I need to call her this morning." Dane looked at him. "Not to scare her," Boone said quickly. "Just—" He stopped. "Just to hear Sophie in the background." Dane put a hand briefly on his shoulder, the uninjured one, and Boone stood a little straighter and neither of them said anything else about it. Miles found it at 6:47 a.m. He came to the alley entrance where the three of them were standing. The sedan had been towed by then, the alley empty again, the city doing its morning thing around them, garbage trucks and early commuters and the smell of someone's coffee from an open window above the service bins. And he turned his phone screen toward them without preamble. "Jennifer Ann Greer," he said. Not his wife, not his sister. They looked at the screen. A federal civil records search, the kind of search that required the kind of contact Miles had at the state AG's office. Jennifer Ann Greer, 44 years old, formerly Jennifer Ann Pressler, changed her name through a legal filing in 2019. Prior address in Inglewood, same general radius as Leonard Greer's registration. Prior employment, County Records Administration, retired 2020 on a medical disability claim. She worked in County Records Administration, Hawk said. For 19 years, Miles said, specifically in the division that managed warrant processing documentation for 3 Southern California counties. The morning air moved through the alley. She managed the paperwork chain, Dane said. She would have known exactly how to slow a warrant down, Miles said, what filings to route through which desks, how to create procedural complications that looked legitimate because they were legitimate. She'd helped design the procedures. He paused. She didn't break any laws. She just used 20 years of institutional knowledge to make sure the right forms went to the right people at the right speed. The retired county employee, Hawk said, in the holding company. Her, she's a principal in the Desert Valley Holdings LLC that owns the storage facility. Miles lowered the phone, which means she didn't just slow the warrant. She owned the building where the evidence was stored. Dane looked at the empty alley. He thought about Fulbright's careful voice saying the holding company issue is real, about the judge on medical leave, about 2 to 3 days for a warrant that should have taken one. She's been protecting him, Boone said, the whole time. Not protecting, Miles said. Managing. There's a difference. Greer is the instrument. Jennifer is the infrastructure. He looked at Dane. Carver's team has been following the money. The money runs through Jennifer's network. Greer is the part of the operation that isn't about money. The part of the operation that isn't about money. Nobody said the thing that sentence described, because it didn't need to be said, because they had all understood it since the moment Fulbright's voice had gone careful at 11 p.m. on the service road. She's already in federal custody, Miles said. Carver's team picked her up 40 minutes ago. Her picture and a summary of her role will be in my hands by 9 a.m., which I will hand directly to Fulbright. Dane looked at him. You've been busy, he said. Someone has to be, Miles said, and put the phone in his pocket. He went to Jess Cross's sister's house at 7:45. The house was on Palmetto Street, the older residential section east of the highway, small houses with established trees and the kind of neighborhood that had been the same for 30 years and intended to stay that way. The sister's name was Carol. She met him at the door before he knocked. She'd been watching the street from the window, and she was the kind of woman who looked at a heavily tattooed man in a worn jacket at her front door at 7:45 in the morning with the expression of someone who had been told enough to decide he was expected. She let him in without a word. The kitchen was warm. Someone had made actual breakfast, eggs, toast, the smell of it replacing everything the last 12 hours had been and offering something simpler instead. Jess was at the kitchen table with a coffee mug in both hands and the look of a woman who had not slept and had stopped pretending that she was going to. Avery was at the table too. She was eating toast and she had her sketchbook in front of her. Not open, just there, the way a familiar object was there when you needed something familiar nearby. She was still in the clothes she'd been woken up in, dark circles, hair loose, and when Dane came into the kitchen, she looked up at him with an expression that was exactly the expression she'd had in the garage doorway on the first day. The assessment, the weight, the specific attention of a child who had learned to read situations before committing to a response. He's in custody, Dane said. He said it to both of them, but he looked at Avery. Jess put her coffee mug down. Avery looked at the sketchbook. It's over? She said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. The man who was following the bus is in custody, he said carefully. The police have his car and the storage unit and a lot of evidence. There are more people involved that other authorities are dealing with separately. It's going to take a long time to fully process all of it. He paused. But the danger to you specifically, that's handled. She was quiet for a moment. You said it carefully, she said. He looked at her. The "it's over" part, she said. You said it carefully. 10 years old. Because it is over, for you, in the way that matters, he said. And the other parts are going to be handled by people whose specific job it is to handle them. And I'm going to make sure of that. He looked at her. Your part is done. You did your part. You documented everything exactly right, and you came to the garage and you told the truth 19 times, and you never stopped even when nobody was listening. Avery looked at the sketchbook for a moment. Then she looked up at him. The others, she said. Hawk and Miles and Boone. Are they okay? Dane thought about the service bin and his shoulder, which had stopped being a hot signal and become a dull, persistent fact. He thought about Boone standing at the alley entrance looking at the windshield crack. He thought about Miles on his phone since 5 a.m. and Hawk on the hood of the Subaru watching the street with the particular patience of a man who had waited out worse situations than a November dawn on a residential curb. Yeah, he said. They're okay. Avery nodded. She opened the sketchbook. She turned to the last page, the one after the 43rd, which had been blank. She picked up the pencil she had tucked inside the cover. She drew the windshield crack, one more time, river shape, splitting near the top. Then she closed the sketchbook and set the pencil down and picked up her toast. The debrief with Fulbright happened at 10 a.m. in the same small office with the broken blind, and it was thorough and long and went through every piece of documentation they'd accumulated and the exact chain of events on the service road and in Crawford Alley. And at the end of it, Fulbright sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Jennifer Greer is cooperating, she said, which means the federal case moves significantly faster. She paused. Greer's 2 prior incidents in Riverside and San Bernardino are being re-examined. Both of the families from those cases have been notified. Dane looked at his hands. The network, he said, is larger than anyone had fully mapped, she said. Jennifer was mid-level. There are layers above her. The federal case is... She stopped. It's going to take time. Carver. Carver is doing his job, she said carefully, which is not the same job as mine, and not the same job as yours. His job is the network. My job is Avery Cross. He looked at her. And your job, she said, is over. He understood the sentence in both of the ways she intended it. The legal meaning, which was that 4 private citizens had operated at the boundary of what was permissible and were now required to step back, and the other meaning, which was quieter and more human, that whatever had been required of them, they had given it, and now the giving was done. The warrant, he said. The delay. Is there any accountability for... Jennifer Greer is cooperating in exchange for a reduced federal exposure, she said. What that means for specific accountability is going to play out in the federal proceeding over the next 2 years, and it's outside my jurisdiction to... I know, he said. He stood up, put his jacket on. I just needed to ask. I know you did, she said. He was at the door when she said his name. He turned. She looked at him across the small office with its broken blind and its copy toner smell and the photograph of a windshield crack that was no longer on her desk, but that he knew she'd looked at enough times to carry the shape of it. You gave her back the 28 days, she said. He looked at her. She'd been counting 19. There were 28 before that she didn't know to count. Fulbright paused. You can't give those back, but she's going to grow up knowing that when she told the truth, someone listened. That's what you gave her. Dane stood in the doorway for a moment. She gave it to herself, he said. She kept the sketchbook. He walked out. They met at the garage at noon, not for any specific purpose. No debrief, no plan, nothing that needed to be discussed. They just ended up there the way they always ended up there, because the garage was the place that existed between all the other places in their lives. The space that belonged to none of them specifically, and all of them by default, where the smell of work and the cold concrete and the flat light made things easier to sit with. Hawk brought food. Miles brought coffee. Boone arrived last, the way he always arrived, at the exact margin of lateness that communicated what it needed to communicate, and he sat down on the stool near the tool bench and wrapped both hands around his coffee and looked at nothing specific for a long moment. I called Sophie's mother, he said. Nobody asked how the call went. They didn't have to. He was sitting here instead of driving south on the 110, which told you most of what there was to know. She let me talk to Sophie, he said, for about 2 minutes. A pause. Sophie told me about a movie she'd seen, he said, about a dog that goes on an adventure. She explained the whole plot, everything, every detail. He looked at the coffee in his hands. I didn't say much, He stopped. I just listened to her talk about the dog. The garage was quiet. Outside, a truck went by on the main street, and the sound of it came and went, and the pigeons in the ruined warehouse were doing something, and the afternoon light was the flat gold kind that happened in November when the sun was low and the air was clear and the hills stood out against the sky in a way they didn't in summer. 14 months, Miles said. 14 months, Hawk confirmed. And a 10-year-old with a sketchbook, Miles said. Hawk looked at Dane. Dane was at the tool bench, doing something with his hands that wasn't quite working, cleaning the carburetor again or pretending to, the motion of it more important than the purpose. He had his jacket off, and the shoulder showed the beginning of a bruise where the bin had caught him, a dark spreading shape that Hawk noticed, and Miles noticed, and Boone noticed, and none of them said anything about. The network, Boone said. It wasn't a question. Federal case, Dane said. Fulbright says 2 years minimum. And in 2 years, someone else will be managing it. He set the carburetor down. Carver. People like Carver. That's their job. And Jennifer Greer, Miles said. She gets a deal. She's cooperating. He picked up a rag. That's how these things work. I know how these things work, Miles said. I'm just saying. I know you are. Boone looked at the garage wall for a moment. It's not enough, he said. What happened this morning, it's real and it's necessary, and it's not enough. No, Dane agreed. It's not. Greer goes to trial. The federal case grinds through its 2 years. The families in Riverside and San Bernardino get a phone call from a detective. And Avery Cross has to grow up knowing her father's name is attached to all of it, knowing why she was chosen, knowing that being Derek Cross's daughter was why a man sat outside her school bus for 14 months. He paused. There's no version of that which is enough. The garage held the sentence. She already knows, Dane said. I didn't tell her, but she knew this morning. She's been knowing. She said at the beginning that he'd been at it longer than 19 days, that he wasn't nervous enough for it to be new. She was working toward the reason even then. He set the rag down. She's going to carry it. That's true. What's also true is she's going to carry it as someone who was believed. Boone looked at him. That's not nothing, Hawk said from the corner. Simple. No argument in it. Boone looked at the floor. No, he said. It's not nothing. But 2 weeks passed. The news reported the arrest. Local, then regional, then a brief national mention that focused on the federal connection and the wider network and said nothing about the storage unit's contents in specific terms, and nothing about 4 men on motorcycles, or a garage on Tanner Spur, or a girl with a sketchbook. The federal investigation generated a press release about financial crimes and organized networks and interagency cooperation. Greer's name appeared in the 3rd paragraph. Jennifer Greer's name appeared in the 5th. Avery Cross's name did not appear. Dane had made sure of that, through Fulbright, with the specific quiet insistence of a man who knew which battles required volume and which required patience, and which just required showing up consistently until the right answer became the path of least resistance. The garage went back to being a garage. The F-150 that had been half oil changed on the night of the service road call came back for the other half, and the owner, a retired postal worker named Gary, didn't ask where Dane had been for 3 weeks, and Dane didn't explain. Harleys came in. Trucks came in. The carburetor got cleaned for real this time and went back where it belonged. The photograph of the windshield crack stayed in the corner of the mirror above the tool bench. He looked at it every day. Jess Cross came to the garage on a Wednesday afternoon beneath buzzing neon and the smell of motor oil, while a late November rain was doing what late November rain in Southern California did, appearing unexpectedly and committing to nothing, just enough to darken the concrete and make the air smell like something had been washed. She stood in the doorway first, the way Avery had stood in the doorway the first time, and Dane understood that this was where Avery had learned it, the checking of a space before entering, the assessment, and the recognition of it moved through him quietly. He wiped his hands and turned to face her. She was still in her work clothes, care home badge still on the lanyard. She'd come directly, which meant she'd decided to come before she'd had time to talk herself out of it. I didn't hear her, she said. He looked at her. I know what you're going to say, she said. You're going to say I was exhausted and I was doing my best, and all of that is true, and I still didn't hear her. She paused. She told me 6 times. She showed me the sketchbook once. I told her it was probably just a coincidence. Jess, I need to say it, she said. I'm not asking you to tell me it's okay, I'm just... She stopped. I need to say it somewhere that isn't my own head. He was quiet. She looked at the garage, at the tools and the workbench and the Harley in the back corner and the fluorescent light and the smell that was its own kind of specific honesty, the smell of things being fixed by hand. She trusts you, Jess said. She has from the beginning. She trusted you before I did. She trusted the sketchbook, he said. She trusted her own documentation. I just agreed with it. That's what trust needs sometimes, she said. Just agreement. He looked at her. She looked at the photograph in the corner of the mirror. The windshield crack, the river shape. She'd seen it before she said anything, but she was looking at it now directly, the way you looked at something once you'd decided to see it. Avery wants to come back, she said. On Saturdays. She said you told her she could ask about how the brakes worked. He remembered saying it. 3 weeks and a lifetime ago, an ordinary afternoon offer extended to a child who needed something ordinary. She can come Saturdays, he said. Jess nodded. She didn't cry, though he'd half expected it. She was not the crying kind, or rather she was the kind who had cried in private and come here already past the worst of it, to do the harder work of saying the thing out loud in front of another person. Thank you, she said. She did the work, he said. She kept the sketchbook. Jess looked at him for a moment longer. So did you, she said. She left. The rain was still doing its non-committal thing outside, darkening the concrete of Tanner's Spur and making the ruined warehouse roof look briefly silver before the cloud moved on and the light came back to its usual afternoon gold. The following Saturday, Avery arrived at 9 a.m. She came through the garage door without stopping in the doorway first, which he noticed, which meant something. Hawk was there. He'd started coming on Saturday mornings. No explanation given or requested. Something about the carburetor project that had evolved into a standing appointment that had nothing to do with carburetors. Miles came by around 10 most Saturdays. Boone came when he could, which was every other weekend, the weekends that Sophie was with her mother, and on the weekends he had Sophie he sometimes brought her by in the afternoon for an hour. And Sophie was 6 years old with a gap between her front teeth and an opinion about every vehicle she saw, and Avery had met her twice now and treated her with the specific careful attention of a child who understood, in some wordless way, what the younger girl's presence in this garage represented. Avery put her backpack on her stool. She looked at the tool bench. You said you'd show me how the brakes worked, she said. I did, Dane agreed. He pulled up a second stool. He took down the brake assembly he'd been working on. A simple drum brake from a vintage Sportster, the kind of component where the mechanism was completely visible, nothing hidden, every part of the system showing its function openly. He set it on the bench between them. Okay, he said. The basic principle is friction. You apply force here, it creates friction here, and friction slows the wheel. He touched the relevant parts as he spoke. Everything in a brake system is just managing that force. How you generate it, how you direct it, how you control it. Avery looked at the mechanism. She leaned forward on her stool. What happens if the friction surface wears down, she said. You replace it, he said, before it fails. How do you know when it's worn down enough to replace? You measure it. There's a minimum thickness. Below that, you don't wait. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the assembly. You don't wait, she repeated. No, he said. You don't wait. From the back corner, Hawk was working on something and not working on it, the way he did. The visible task covering the actual task, which was being present in a specific space without requiring the space to be different from what it was. His hands moved on the engine component. His eyes were elsewhere. The garage light came through the roll-up door and made the chrome on the Harley in the corner do the thing it always did on clear mornings. A hard, bright scatter of light that moved as the sun moved, shifting across the concrete floor in a slow arc, finding the dust motes and the oil stains and the tools on their hooks. Avery picked up a pencil from the jar on the bench. She opened her sketchbook. The same one, the original, 43 pages plus the final windshield drawing and now a new blank page. And she drew the brake assembly. She drew it carefully, the way she drew everything, with the specific attention of someone who had learned that detail was not obsession, but responsibility. She drew the friction surface and the force application point and the connection between them. Dane watched her draw. He didn't say anything. He handed her a coffee can lid to use as a reference surface for scale, and she used it and adjusted her drawing and kept going. Outside, a motorcycle passed on the main street 2 blocks away. Not any of theirs, just someone going somewhere on a Saturday morning. And the sound of it came through the garage door and moved through the space and faded, the way sounds did, going wherever sounds went when they were done being sounds. Avery drew the brake assembly. The chrome caught the morning light. Miles arrived at 10:15 with coffees and a complaint about the traffic on Miramar, and Hawk told him the traffic on Miramar was always terrible, and Miles said he knew, but was registering the objection anyway. And Avery looked up from the sketchbook at the exchange, and something happened in her face. Small, barely visible, the specific unclenching of a thing that had been held tight for a very long time. She looked back at the drawing. She added a small detail she'd missed, a clip at the edge of the friction surface, a minor component, and got it right on the first attempt. Dane looked at the drawing. He looked at the windshield crack photograph in the corner of the mirror. He looked at Avery Cross, 10 years old, drawing brake components on a Saturday morning in a garage that smelled like grease and coffee and old leather, and the specific accumulated history of 4 men who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the before didn't have to define the after. He picked up his coffee. He did not say anything, because there was nothing to say, because the story had arrived at the place stories arrived when they'd gone the distance they needed to go. Not at a conclusion, exactly, but at a settling. The way a long, stressed piece of metal settled when the force was finally removed, not returning to what it was before, but finding the new shape it had become. The morning went on. The light moved across the concrete floor. The chrome caught it, and scattered it, and caught it again. And in the garage on Tanner Spur, in the flat gold of a November Saturday, nobody was afraid.